Welcome to our today's class, Lesson 6, in our unit on conflict and conflict resolution in Africa. Today's lesson focuses on causes and sources of conflicts in Africa. My name is Professor Kennedy Mutundu, an Associate Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Social and Development Studies. My contacts are on the screen. You can be able to contact me. This is an outline of our lesson today. I'll start by reviewing the objectives and outcomes of this class. I'll review the previous lesson and link it to today's lesson. Then we'll proceed to go through a classification of conflicts, followed by why Africa has unique classification schemes of conflicts, and then proceed to go to the main presentation of our class today on primary causes of conflicts, secondary causes of conflicts, and tertiary causes of conflicts. And towards the end of the lesson, we'll do a summary of our lesson today. Today's lesson has a number of objectives, the first one being to review classification schemes of conflict and identify unique features of conflicts in Africa. Then we'll review schemes of classifying and analyzing causes and sources of conflicts and identify those features that are unique to conflicts in Africa. We will apply the Department of Foreign International Development scheme of classification in explaining secondary, tertiary, and primary conflicts in Africa. At the end of the lesson, our learners will be able to appreciate the complexity of conflicts in Africa and make an evaluation of which schemes are most useful in explaining this complexity. Students of conflict studies will also be exposed to case studies, which henceforth they will now be able to apply the principles that we have learned today in classifying these conflicts. From the previous lessons that we have had on types of conflicts, we saw that conflicts can be classified in different ways. Conflicts can be classified on the basis of the causes and sources for those conflicts. Conflicts can also be classified on the basis of how these conflicts are expressed, whether they are manifest conflicts or the conflicts are simply at latent level. We can also classify conflicts on the number of combatants, where we have only one person involved in the conflict or two or more groups involved in the conflict. We can also classify conflicts, as we saw, on the level of impact of those conflicts, whether the conflicts have major impacts in terms of loss of people or in terms of loss of property. We can also classify conflicts on the basis of the stages of that conflict. We can also classify conflicts on the basis of whether these conflicts are intranational, they are national, or they involve more than two states. Of note is that some of these classification schemes are relevant and more applicable to certain conflicts, whereas other classification schemes are not applicable. For instance, some classification schemes are more applicable to Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. Other classification schemes are more applicable to Europe and other parts of the world. The classification and analysis of the causes of conflicts are more problematic because there are so many variables that are involved in classifying the causes. A conflict arises out of many variables, and it's important for us to understand that this complexity requires us to explain these sources very systematically. And that's what our focus of today's class is. How can we classify and be able to explain and analyze conflicts in Africa? Let's review the different ways in which we can classify the causes of conflicts In the previous slide, we saw how conflicts can be classified. But how about the causes and sources? First, many conflicts can be classified at the levels of expressions, that the causes of conflicts are obvious and they can be seen, they are manifest, but sometimes the causes can be hidden. Causes can also be classified in terms of the values and interests, so that groups of people have got conflicting interests and values. Conflicts can also be classified in terms of time, where you do a longitudinal survey and see how conflicts have evolved from the beginning to today. Some people classify conflicts in terms and analyze them from how the conflicts began, developed, and how they present themselves today. The causes of conflicts can also be classified in terms of whether the causes are ideological. And we have causes that are based on religious ideology, political ideology, or social ideology. And you can classify conflicts on that basis. We can also classify the causes according to the group dynamics, that the causes are within a group, or the causes are between a group, or the causes are between different groups of people. The causes can also be explained on the basis of whether they are internal to a state or internal to a group, or in terms of whether the causes are international. Then we have got also regional classifications where the causes in different parts of the world are classified differently. For purposes of our class, we'll focus on the final, on the last bullet, classification of conflicts on the basis of levels of causality. Because it's a complex matter, we'll explain how this is in reference to conflicts in Africa. Why Africa has unique and complex matrix of causes and sources of conflicts. Africa is unique in the sense that, to begin with, Africa has a sparse of geographical identity and historical factors that makes the continent to be very diverse. This means that the causes of conflicts have these factors of geography and factors of history that explain how those conflicts are expressed today. Then Africa has a strong background of colonial factors. The colonial legacy also informs how these causes can be expressed. Then contemporary contexts also explain these different factors. So with this complexity in mind, the explanations that you can use to explain causes of conflict in other parts of the world may not be applicable to Africa, and therefore we have to take a more analytical look at how these conflicts can be done, so that we can be able to capture the wide variety of scenarios and contexts that are presented by conflicts in Africa. The Department of Foreign International Development has developed a scheme which captures not just the different contexts, but also the different scenarios that we have explained can be explained in conflicts. This table summarizes DFID's classification of conflicts. We have primary causes of conflicts, we have secondary causes of conflicts, and tertiary causes of conflicts. In the middle column, we have got an explanation for those conflicts. Primary or root causes of conflicts are underlying factors that cause a conflict. They are the common denominators of all other factors that can arise out of that conflict. Examples of these are causes that are linked to inequality, state collapse, natural resources. We'll review this in our next slide. Secondary causes are those causes that enable and sustain a conflict. They are not necessarily underlying, but when a conflict arises, these factors will sustain that conflict. Examples of those are unemployment, abuse of ethnicity, availability of arms. And again, we'll be reviewing that. Then you have got tertiary causes, which are factors or drivers that hinder resolution of a conflict. And examples of those are regional interlocking conflicts, the conflict circle, and inadequate mediation. We'll go through each of these to explain how they apply to African situations. Primary or root causes. The first and most obvious cause of conflict in Africa is linked to inequality. Inequality in Africa is in terms of access to political power, access to economic resources, and access to social privileges. This inequality, while it is rampant in all other parts of the world, in Africa, it has got its genesis in the sense that Africa as a continent is so diverse and offers different opportunities that can also be exploited by different groups of people for different reasons. So that in terms of time, that's in terms of space, that's the geographical space, and also in terms of time, the causes of conflict in Africa that are linked to inequality have got this deep time breadth that can be looked at. Inequality arises between groups, and as I've said, the inequality is linked to economic, social, and political factors. And this inequality enables certain groups of people to have access to political power, and these groups that have access to political power are able to monopolize that power. When you monopolize power and you have got unequal access to power, you also have unequal access to resources. People in power will have unequal access to resources. When you have got unequal access to resources, you also have unequal access to the revenues that are associated with those resources. Differential access to power and resources leads also to differential access to education and social privileges. Inequality is also expressed in terms of differences and grounds for conflict between two groups or more cultural groups, so that even though you have got differential access to power, and you've got differential access to economic resources, these differences are also accelerated by differences in culture and also differences in the geographical spaces that we occupy. The next primary cause of conflict is state collapse. The collapse of the state can be reflected in so many different ways. First is the collapse of state institutions. The state has got command of different institutions, especially those institutions that are important in controlling power. The military, for instance, is an important state institution. The police is an important state institution, and other attendant institutions that make a state to be recognized as a sovereign state. When you have got weak or near collapse institutions, these institutions are characterized by, one, coercion. Therefore, they'll always coerce their citizens. These weak institutions are also corrupt, and these institutions also are characterized by personality politics. And when you have got this state, access to basic services also collapse. When access to basic services collapse, people end up being insecure. The collapse of infrastructure completes the breakup of the state, so that when institutions break up also, other infrastructural services such as roads, such as communications, collapse and contribute to the collapse of the state. When the state collapses, it breaks up into smaller states, which we refer to as shell states. A shell state is a shell that is fragmented, like just the shell of an egg that has got different parts. But within that shell also, we also have factions, which are also determined to maintain their own hold onto power. When you have got fractured states or shell states, this is a classic example of where the state collapses and then the infrastructure collapses and also institutions collapse. And that contributes now to more conflict that arises out of the collapse. In Africa, and Africa is so dependent, people in Africa are so dependent on natural resources. And this can be considered as a primary cause of conflict in Africa. How is this reflected? We have got two types of resources in resource conflicts in Africa. One, are conflicts that are focused on scarcity and conflicts that arise out of the abundance of resources. So in cases where we have scarce resources, it still contributes to conflict, and when we have also abundance of conflicts, it still contributes to conflicts. In the case of scarcity, this relates to the control of fewer resources within a small area, pastures, grazing pastures, water and forest resources within a location that are being competed over by a small group of people. So once in a while, these resources are not enough to sustain different groups of people, or one group of people is interested in that resource when others are not interested in that resource. Then you have got abundance of resources. In Africa, you have got resources that you could consider abundant. The problem is that even though the resources are abundant, these resources are abundant but also under the control of certain groups of people. Okay. When, in either case, when you've got competition over these resources, the price for these resources is controlling of the state. When a state controls these resources at the expense of other groups of people, it certainly contributes to conflicts. Within a state also, you have unfair exploitation of resources, so that some groups of people will have access to the resources and other groups of people will not have access to those resources. And those that have access to those resources in those particular regions will tend to pull away. And this is the example that you've had in Southern Sudan, where access to oil in Southern Sudan has provoked the secession of Southern Sudan from Northern Sudan. Abundant resources can also attract external interventions. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the abundant resources there may not be able to be exploited by local people, but attract external people who are able to exploit those resources. And companies in the Democratic Republic of Congo are actively involved as active participants of exploitation of those resources and using those resources to flare up the conflicts between groups of people. Okay. The private sector is also important for this. In Nigeria, for instance, the oil exploitation is done by private companies. In some states, the military also usually takes over these resources. When they take over these resources, the resources are able to sustain those conflicts. Then we go to secondary causes of conflict. These are conflicts that sustain conflicts that are already there. When you have got a conflict that is based on resources, a conflict that is based on inequality, secondary causes can mean to sustain that conflict. And one overriding factor in Africa for as a secondary cause of conflict is unemployment. Unemployment, especially among the youth, is a contributing factor, where we have conflict in the place and then you have got unemployment among the youth contributes largely to the conflicts in Africa. High levels of unemployment and low levels of education go together. High levels of unemployment and low levels of education, especially among young males. When this is the scenario, these groups of people make up a pool of marginalized or socially excluded young men, and they become targets for ideological manipulation and recruitment into warring factional parties. For instance, in Rwanda, even though we had differences that were primary conflicts that were based on resources, what flared up that conflict was the recruitment of young men into these warring factions. The conflict in Liberia was also fought by socially marginalized young people. The groups that we have, religious groups that we have, Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram, target marginalized and lowly educated young men for recruitment. So unemployment that is linked to education and linked to population pressure contributes to conflicts in Africa. The secondary conflict is abuse of ethnicity. And even though Africa has got these diverse regions, diverse cultures, and where you've got linguistic, cultural, and regional differences are exploited and to present groups as different from others. These groups are naturally and culturally different, but the differences are exploited by political leaders. The war in the Democratic Republic of Congo is a good example of ethnicity. And in many parts of Africa, while you have got conflicts over natural resources, the abuse of ethnicity, using different groups of people to present themselves as enemies when even we didn't have these differences, is what contributes to the flaring up of conflict in Africa. In Southern Sudan, the elite have their own differences, but will exploit differences between groups of people to present a group as different from the other. That is abuse of ethnicity. Then the other secondary cause in Africa is availability of arms, especially small arms. The wars that have taken place in Africa, in Ethiopia, Somalia, Angola, and Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the leftovers, even though in some of these cases like Angola, we no longer have armed conflict, we still have an abundance of small arms that are still in the hands of people. So the availability of these arms is something that contributes to the flaring of these conflicts. And these arms, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, have become more available, and accessing these arms is much more easier because of the trade by use of minerals. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Southern Sudan, states and groups of people exploiting these resources are able to access these arms much more easily. So it's both not just the internal state collapse in those areas, but also the availability of those arms. And even in areas like Kenya, where we do not have conflicts, when we have conflicts in neighboring countries, these small arms spill over into countries like Kenya and are also used by local communities to flare up the conflict in those areas, where it's not even a conflict, but it is flared up by the availability of those small arms. Then we have finally the tertiary causes. These are factors that do not necessarily cause the original conflicts, but when you've got a conflict and efforts to resolve these conflicts are compounded by these tertiary factors. One is the regional and interlocking conflicts. In Africa, for instance, in the interlacustrine region, in the interlacustrine region, Rwanda, Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Southern Sudan, these are countries that, as a conflict in one area is affected and intertwined by other conflicts in other parts. So even if you resolved a conflict in Uganda, the interests of Uganda in Rwanda are going to contribute to the perpetuation of that conflict in Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The conflict in Southern Sudan spills over to the Democratic Republic of Congo. So even when we want to resolve some conflicts in some parts of the country, in some parts of Africa, it will not be possible because that conflict is also perpetuated in other parts of Africa. And then we have got the conflict circle. This is where a conflict is not resolved. And sometimes a conflict is not resolved because it is both beneficial to the combatants. So that even when you've got a fragile peace, it is there for the benefit of the groups of people who are in conflict. And the benefits of the conflict outweigh the reasons for resolving that conflict. Okay. Then the final two tertiary causes of conflicts is the lack of guarantors for conflicts. When we have groups of people who have even agreed to resolve their conflicts, many times we lack institutions or groups of people who can be able to support. The international community through the United Nations and in Africa through the African Union contributes to this, but sometimes they don't have the capacity to be able to resolve those conflicts. And sometimes even when those institutions are in place, they are inadequate or they use inappropriate mediation processes, and these conflicts continue to flare. So in our today's class, we were able to analyze and understand conflicts that is complex because of the several factors that are involved, and schemes of classification are going to vary from region to regions. Africa has got its own unique conditions and circumstances that require unique classification schemes, and an analysis of conflicts in Africa is better done on the basis of understanding the primary root causes, the secondary and tertiary causes, and because this scheme accommodates various levels of causes of conflicts, and the different levels of conflicts are accommodated. Okay, that's the end of our lesson today.
These televised lectures supplement our robust online learning going on our MKU online platform. You can view more on our televised lectures via our online platform. We are in a digital era, and Mount Kenya University knows this. The following are the steps to follow so as to complete your online application. Download the application form from the website www.mku.ac.ke. Attach copies of your academic certificates and ID. Pay the application fees via M-Pesa pay bill number 270988. Your ID is the account number. 2,000 shillings is the charge for a postgraduate. You can also deposit in the bank accounts provided on the website. Then email all the above to apply@mku.ac.ke.